You know what's funny about marriage? People think they know the whole story just from hearing one side. Like when someone tells you their husband filed for divorce after 16 years, you automatically assume he's going through some midlife crisis or found someone younger. But sometimes, and I'm just being honest here, sometimes the guy actually has his reasons that go way deeper than anyone wants to admit. I'm Veronica. I'm 38, and my husband Ted just served me divorce papers 3 weeks ago. Not because of anything recent, mind you. This goes back to when we were basically kids ourselves, 24 years old, and thought we had forever to figure our shit out. The thing is, Ted remembers everything. Every conversation, every promise, every single detail from 16 years ago, like it happened yesterday. Most people would call that romantic, but trust me, it's not always a blessing when someone has a memory like a steel trap. We got married way too young, I'll give you that. Both of us came from homes that were complete disasters. Ted's dad left when he was 2, and my parents were the kind of people who screamed at each other every night after dinner and then acted like nothing happened the next morning. The difference was, Ted decided he was going to break the cycle or whatever. Me, I figured we'd just figure it out as we went along, like most people do. Ted was always dragging us to counseling sessions and support groups. He'd read these self-help books and want to discuss them over dinner, like we were in some kind of book club. I went along with it because that's what you do when you love someone, right? But honestly, I was just nodding and smiling while thinking about other things. All that therapy talk felt so heavy and serious when we were supposed to be newlyweds having fun. By our 4th year, I was getting restless. All my friends were buying houses, having babies, posting these perfect family pictures online. Meanwhile, Ted and I were still in our tiny apartment because he said we needed to be emotionally ready before taking big steps. We'd agreed that kids would happen around the 5-year mark, but I was watching everyone else live their lives while we were still talking about our childhood trauma every week. That's when Kyle started coming around more often. Kyle worked construction with Ted, and he'd stop by after work sometimes for a beer and to watch whatever game was on. While Ted was always so intense about everything, Kyle actually made me laugh. He'd notice when I cooked something new, compliment my hair when I tried a different style, just basic stuff that made me feel like an actual woman instead of a therapy project. The first time anything happened, it really wasn't planned. Ted was working late on some job site, and Kyle came by looking for some tools Ted had borrowed. We ended up talking for hours about normal things, not childhood issues or emotional growth, just regular conversation. When he kissed me, it felt like the first time in months that someone actually saw me as desirable instead of damaged goods that needed fixing. I told myself it was just a one-time thing afterward, a stupid mistake that wouldn't happen again. But Ted was so wrapped up in his personal development journey that he didn't even notice I was acting different. He'd come home and immediately start talking about some article he'd read or asking if I'd done the homework our counselor assigned. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there knowing I just spent the afternoon with his friend, and he's completely oblivious. The thing about having a secret like that is it becomes addictive. Every time Kyle would text or we'd all hang out together, there was this electric feeling knowing something Ted didn't know. Kyle was everything Ted wasn't in those days. Spontaneous, easygoing, didn't analyze every single interaction we had. When I was with Kyle, I didn't have to discuss my emotional triggers or practice communication techniques. We just enjoyed each other's company. But Kyle wasn't looking for anything serious, which became obvious pretty quickly. He had other women he was seeing, and honestly, I think the fact that I was married made it more exciting for him rather than more complicated. So when he started pulling back, becoming less available, I panicked. Instead of ending things and focusing on my marriage like any rational person would do, I did something even more stupid. I started seeing Eric, this guy I'd met at the gym. Eric was different from both Ted and Kyle. Older, seemed to have his life together, and he actually appeared interested in something real with me. He'd take me to nice restaurants, buy me little gifts, treat me like I was someone special instead of a work in progress. For a few months there, I was basically living two completely separate lives. At home, I was Ted's wife going through the motions of our recovery process. But with Eric, I was this exciting woman who didn't need to justify or explain herself to anyone. The problem with juggling multiple relationships is eventually something has to give. Ted started asking more questions about where I was going, why I was always checking my phone, why I seemed distracted during our sessions. I got defensive about it, which only made him more suspicious. I started picking fights over stupid things to justify spending time away from the apartment. Looking back, I was basically sabotaging my marriage while telling myself Ted was the problem for being so controlling and jealous about everything. Everything came crashing down when Ted found a receipt in my purse for emergency contraception. I'd completely forgotten it was there after a scare with Eric. When Ted confronted me about it, I did what came naturally. I lied. Told him it was old, that I'd bought it months ago just to have on hand. But Ted's not stupid, and when you've been with someone for 4 years, you know their tells. He knew I was lying, and that's when he started digging deeper into everything. When Ted found that receipt, it was like watching a switch flip in him. Suddenly, this man who'd spent 4 years being patient and understanding and working on himself turned into someone I didn't recognize. He went through my phone while I was sleeping, checked my email accounts, even called Kyle directly to ask if anything had happened between us. And Kyle, being the stand-up guy he was, immediately threw me under the bus to protect his friendship with Ted. The confrontation was brutal in a way I wasn't prepared for. Ted didn't yell or throw things like my dad used to do. Instead, he sat me down with this manila folder full of evidence. Screenshots of text messages, photos, receipts, even a timeline he'd created of when I'd been lying about where I was. It was like he'd turned into some kind of detective overnight, and honestly, it freaked me out how methodical and calm he was about the whole thing. He asked me point blank, "How many men have there been, Veronica?" I tried to minimize it at first. Told him about Kyle, but made it sound like it was just an emotional connection that got out of hand one time. But Ted kept pushing for details, and eventually I had to admit about Eric too. The expression on his face when I told him there were 2 different guys, I'd never seen him look at me like that before. Like I was a complete stranger. Like everything he thought he knew about me was a lie. Here's the thing though. When you're caught red-handed like that, there's this weird sense of relief that comes with it. All that energy I'd been putting into keeping stories straight and covering my tracks could finally go somewhere else. But instead of feeling grateful that Ted was willing to work through it with me, I found myself getting angry. He wanted to know every single detail, every conversation, every time I'd been with someone else. It felt invasive and humiliating, like he was punishing me for being honest. We started going to couples counseling, but I hated every minute of those sessions. The therapist kept talking about rebuilding trust and taking accountability for your actions, but all I could think about was how I'd already said I was sorry. How many different ways was I supposed to apologize for the same mistakes? Ted, meanwhile, was throwing himself into the healing process like it was his full-time job. Reading books about infidelity, joining online support groups for betrayed spouses, tracking my whereabouts like I was some kind of criminal on parole. The worst part was how everyone in our lives treated me after they found out what had happened. Ted's family, who'd always been warm and welcoming to me, suddenly became cold and formal whenever I was around. My own friends started making comments about how lucky I was that Ted was giving me another chance instead of just divorcing me immediately. Like I should spend the rest of my life being grateful that my own husband didn't abandon me. It was exhausting, being cast as the villain in everyone else's story when all I'd done was try to find some happiness in a marriage that felt more like a therapy program than a relationship. We decided to try for a baby about a year after everything came out, partly because our counselor thought it might give us something positive to focus on together instead of constantly rehashing the past. I got pregnant pretty quickly with Logan, and for a while there, things actually felt almost normal again. Ted was excited about becoming a father, and pregnancy gave me a good excuse for why I was moody or distant sometimes. It was easier to blame hormones than admit I still felt trapped in this dynamic we'd created. Logan was born healthy and perfect, and Ted turned out to be one of those annoyingly devoted fathers from day one. He did night feedings without complaining, changed diapers like he'd been doing it his whole life, read parenting books like they contained the secrets of the universe. I loved Logan, obviously, but Ted's intensity about being the perfect dad made me feel like I was constantly being measured against some impossible standard that I'd never be able to meet. He'd make these comments about wanting to break cycles and give Logan the stable childhood we never had, which sounded great in theory but felt like a constant reminder of my failures as a person. When Logan was fussy, Ted would swoop in like I was doing something wrong. When I wanted to go out with friends for a few hours, he'd ask a million questions about where and with who and when I'd be back. When I got a job and had to work late sometimes, he'd show up unannounced claiming he was bringing me dinner, but really just checking up on me. For the next 12 years, we just existed in this weird limbo. Ted never really forgave me for what happened, but he never brought it up directly either. Instead, it was always there under the surface of everything we did. He'd make little comments about trust and loyalty that seemed innocent enough to anyone listening, but I knew they were really about what I'd done when we were 24. Every conversation felt like a test I might fail if I said the wrong thing. The physical part of our marriage got weird too, like really intense and almost desperate, but not in a good way. It felt like Ted was trying to reclaim something or prove something every single time. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with this look on his face, like he was searching for signs that I was thinking about someone else. It was like being married to a detective who happened to share your bed every night. I threw myself into being Logan's mom because that was the one area where I felt like I couldn't be criticized or second-guessed. Logan was this bright, funny kid who adored both of us, and I was determined to be the kind of mother I'd never had growing up. But even that became a source of tension, because Ted was always worried I'd somehow mess up Logan the way I'd messed up our marriage. Like my moral failures were contagious, or something that might rub off on our son. By the time Logan turned 10, I started fantasizing about what my life would be like if I'd never gotten caught with Kyle and Eric. Not because I wanted to cheat again. I didn't. But because I was tired of living under this cloud of perpetual judgment and surveillance. Ted had turned into this hyper-vigilant version of himself, and I felt like I was married to a prison guard instead of a partner. Every conversation, every interaction felt loaded with the potential for conflict. Everything finally exploded last year, when Logan started asking questions about why Daddy seemed sad all the time. Ted had been getting more withdrawn over the months, working longer hours, barely talking to me, unless it was about logistics or Logan's schedule. When I tried to bring it up during one of our rare quiet moments together, he'd just say he was processing some things or working through stuff. More therapy speak that made me want to scream after all these years. I finally confronted him on our anniversary. We were supposed to go out to dinner at this place we used to love, but Ted seemed like he was just going through the motions, like it was an obligation instead of something he wanted to do. When I asked him directly if he even wanted to be married to me anymore, he just stared at me for what felt like forever. Then, he said something that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. I've been asking myself that same question every day for 12 years. That's when everything came pouring out. He told me he'd never actually forgiven me for Kyle and Eric, that he'd been pretending for Logan's sake this entire time. That every single day of our marriage, since the affairs, had felt like he was living with a stranger wearing his wife's face. He said he'd tried everything: individual therapy, medication, even some kind of spiritual counseling, but he couldn't get past what I'd done to us. And the worst part? He said he was tired of feeling like the bad guy for not being able to just move on, like everyone kept telling him he should. I completely lost it. Told him he was punishing me for something that happened over a decade ago, when we were practically kids who didn't know anything about marriage or commitment, that he'd made our entire relationship about his inability to forgive instead of focusing on building something good together. That maybe, if he'd actually tried to see my perspective, instead of playing the victim for 12 straight years, we might have had a real marriage instead of this weird surveillance situation we'd been living in. He just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not hurt or angry or even disappointed, just completely done. He said, "You still don't get it, do you? After all this time, after everything we've been through, you still think you're the one who got wronged here." Then he told me he'd already talked to a lawyer, that he'd been planning this conversation for months, that he was tired of pretending we had a marriage worth saving when we both knew it had been over for years. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and legal consultations. Ted moved into the guest room and started making arrangements for joint custody, like he'd been thinking about it for a while. He was methodical about the whole process, just like he'd been about everything else in our marriage. Made spreadsheets of our assets, researched Logan's school district boundaries, even found a child psychologist to help Logan adjust to the divorce. Meanwhile, I was just trying to process that my 16-year marriage was ending because my husband couldn't get over something that happened when we were barely adults. The divorce was finalized 8 months ago, and honestly, it's been a complete nightmare from start to finish. Ted got the house because he could afford the mortgage payments on his own, and the judge thought it would be better for Logan's stability to stay in the same school district. I got half the equity, which sounds fair until you factor in how much lawyers cost and how impossible it is to find a decent apartment in this market on what I make working part-time. Ted also got primary custody, which still makes me furious every time I think about it. Just because he makes more money and has this stable home environment doesn't automatically make him a better parent than me. But apparently, having affairs 16 years ago makes you a flight risk in family court, even though I've been nothing but devoted to Logan since the day he was born. Now I get him every other weekend and one dinner during the week, like I'm some kind of distant relative instead of his mother. The worst part is watching how quickly Ted moved on with his life. Not with another woman. He's too smart to introduce that complication during custody negotiations, but with everything else. He joined some kind of men's support group, started working out again, even took Logan on this big camping trip to Colorado that I wasn't invited to join. It's like the second he got rid of me, he became this whole new version of himself that I never got to see during our marriage. Meanwhile, I'm stuck in this tiny studio apartment, trying to figure out how to rebuild my entire existence at 38 years old. Logan's adjusting to the new arrangement better than I expected, which is simultaneously good news and incredibly painful to watch. He seems happier when he's with Ted, which I try not to take personally, but it's hard not to notice the difference. Ted's always been the fun parent because he didn't have to handle most of the discipline and daily grind. Now he gets to be the primary parent and the hero who saved Logan from our dysfunctional household. Everyone acts like this whole situation is some kind of cosmic justice, like Ted finally standing up for himself after all these years of being the long-suffering husband. His family barely acknowledges my existence now when they pick up Logan, and even my own friends seem to think I had this coming. They're all very polite about it, never saying anything directly, but I can see the judgment in their eyes. Like I'm finally getting what I deserved for those few months of poor choices I made when I was 24 years old. But here's what really gets me about this whole thing. Ted acts like he's completely innocent in how our marriage fell apart. Like his inability to forgive, his constant surveillance, his emotional withdrawal for over a decade, had absolutely nothing to do with why we couldn't make it work. He's rewritten our entire history to make himself the long-suffering victim, and me, the villain, who destroyed our family with her selfishness. And everyone just goes along with that narrative because cheating is easy to understand and emotional neglect is invisible. So here I am, alone in an apartment that's barely bigger than Logan's bedroom used to be, working a job that barely covers my basic expenses, seeing my son every other weekend like he's some kind of reward I have to earn through good behavior. Ted gets to keep the house, the respect of everyone we know, primary custody of our child, and the satisfaction of being right about everything. And me? I get to start over with nothing at 38, carrying the label of cheater for the rest of my life. All because I made some stupid decisions when I was basically still a kid myself. But sure, everyone can keep pretending this is justice. Everyone can keep acting like 16 years of emotional punishment was a reasonable consequence for a few months of bad judgment. Everyone can keep believing that Ted's version of events is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I know what really happened in our marriage, and I know I wasn't the only one who gave up on making it work. But apparently, that doesn't matter when you're the one who cheated first.